told you! I told you! One of my predictions came true. But to find out which prediction came true, stay tuned. Before we proceed with the winners and losers, I do need to give a big shout out to Logan Sargeant. He was very much a gentleman for giving up his car. Not many other drivers would have done that. I pretty much made this video right here the main explanation as to why he was benched, but the fact that he went along with it, he was a good sport, and I hope that Williams do recognise what he did. But what we also need to recognise is the work of Carlos Sainz. What more can be said? Comes back from surgery and is the more convincing Ferrari driver for the entire weekend. I'm seeing more and more people online just looking at what Carlos Sainz is doing, and that despite being out of a race, he's still only 7 points behind Charles, and are going, wait a minute. Now, I'm not questioning the situation with Lewis. I'm just questioning about the timing of removing Carlos before the season even began. Sure, I'm not saying that Carlos decimated Charles Leclerc. In a way, he sort of didn't, because Charles did come up from 5th place to 2nd, and we did get our first Ferrari 1-2 in Australia since 2004, so 20 years at this point, so it's a major win for Ferrari. But Sainz was more composed, and he was dictating the race pace from the very beginning, and he was able to overtake Max Verstappen on the road before the problem that Max had really reared its ugly head. Then you got to remember that despite Max Verstappen not winning the race, overall the race was relatively sedate once Carlos Sainz was ahead. There weren't really any major perils in terms of who was going to lead the race, or at least after the first third. And also, this was Carlos's first victory where he hadn't put the car on pole. Yes, of course, it was the front row, so it's not exactly saying all that much, it's just a few meters, but Carlos Sainz has done something that he hadn't done before. And now we can actually say that the last 2 Ferrari victories were not from Charles Leclerc, but the guy they are giving the sack. And you just got to think, oh dear. Once again, this seems to be the management of Ferrari trying to get one over the likes of Fred Vasseur. I'm pretty sure if it was entirely up to Fred Vasseur, he wouldn't be getting rid of Carlos right now, but I've said enough about that topic. Yes, when you actually see him get out of the car, he's a little bit like, yeah, but that's to be expected. That's major surgery. The fact he was able to drive the car to the limit and win, convincingly so, good on you, Carlos. I'm really, really proud of you. And it's a reason why I've been backing Carlos all this time. Not just because he raced for McLaren, but because he, say it with me now, is a smooth operator. He almost forgot to sing it. It was his engineer reminding him to do it. Now, we need to talk about Charles Leclerc. He is a winner too, because, be honest, going from 5th place to 2nd place, I would call that a win. And if people are saying that Charles was no good and that he was terrible throughout the weekend, we've really got to listen to what Fred Vasseur has been saying. He's been very much coming to the defense of Charles Leclerc, because I'm pretty sure he is aware that many people will be asking questions about Charles and why Carlos is getting the boot. He basically said, Fred, that, yeah, that rhymed, that it was essentially just down to not a setup issue, that Charles's car was dialed in, but due to race circumstances, Charles was compromised. But when it came to the end phase of the race, he actually had a good car. And to be fair, he was right, because near the end phase of the race, Charles was having a really good pace, and it looked very, very close for him, giving his teammate a little bit of a challenge. And yes, it was neutralized earlier on, but I feel like Carlos would have been able to counter it. But either way, the fact that we got a Ferrari 1-2, and that Charles Leclerc was able to capitalize somewhat on Max's misfortune, to meaning that he is now only 4 points behind Max Verstappen, and that we actually have a championship contention 3 races in, I'm glad that means that the race for the title is still alive. The Ferrari double podium in the era of Red Bull, and they are on the top 2 steps. Not too shabby. Now, McLaren, absolute winners. 3 races in and over 50 points in the bank. They are now convincingly in 3rd place. They now have just as many points as Aston Martin and Mercedes combined. That's sure, they are not close enough to Ferrari and Red Bull on the average day, but they are somewhat good, and they are holding position as 3rd fastest, more consistently so. And in time, they might catch up to Ferrari, we don't know at this time, but right now, where they had been for the last couple of years, over 50 points this early on into the season, that is fantastic. And with both drivers driving really convincing races, and Lando holding on to P3, despite the fact that he was a little bit out of position. He got the 3rd place through Checo's penalty, but he looked quite competent throughout the entire race, and at some points he was looking like he could have gone after Carlos and kept within at least 5 to 10 seconds of the Ferrari, which in the grand scheme of things is a really good show from McLaren when they are still in their relative base spec car. But yes, I will admit, what also helped them and the likes of Piastri from not losing 4th place was the fact that Checo's car, as we've heard from Christian Horner, was damaged when he overtook Fernando Alonso for 5th, which meant that his floor was damaged and thusly his tyres would be graining up more, he couldn't really have the pace, which meant that his charge for 4th place was relatively neutralised and compromised. But either way, McLaren 3rd and 4th, and we now actually have a result on paper which is very old school. Reminiscent of the 90s and early 2000s Ferrari versus McLaren again, and that is brilliant. I am so happy to see this, and McLaren getting their best result in Australia for about a decade or so. Piastri was good too, and you could say at some points one was better than the other, but of course at the end of the day, Lando got the higher position and made fewer mistakes. In fact, I think he barely made any mistakes. Piastri did have his little off at the last corner, which meant that he lost a few seconds, and thusly he had no chance of going after Lando and trying to catch him. He did have to play the team game in swapping positions, and McLaren did have a little bit of an issue with their strategy at the beginning when Oscar undercut Lando, and that meant Lando had to overtake him again, but at least they did it in a relatively timely fashion. The plan didn't quite work out the way they wanted it to, but considering that Red Bull had a little bit of a mardy weekend, 3rd and 4th in the 3rd fastest car. They'll take that, and I'll take that. Aston Martin. Well, given the Alonso 20-second penalty, which I admit is a little bit on the harsh side, I will still call them winners here because they are the 5th fastest team, and the amount of points that they've been able to bag is a pretty tidy sum that otherwise they would be guaranteed at least 3 points. They've come away with double figures, and Lance Stroll putting in a very, very quiet performance, out-qualifying Fernando. Okay, Fernando had some issues, but he still out-qualified him, and then he ended up being in P6, and that, even in 2023, Lance in 6th place would have been a pretty good result, and to get it this year, that is something to be praised. Lance Stroll, despite the fact he's not setting the world alight, is having a much more calm and sedate start to his campaign. That is something to be credited as part of Aston Martin being winners here. And even with Fernando, he was able to capitalise on the virtual safety car from Hamilton's retirement, and I thought, oh, that's a wily old fox, Fernando. But then, of course, we had the 20-second penalty, but I'll talk more about that in Alonso's section. But Aston Martin should be quite pleased. This has meant that they are now back in the hunt for 4th place in the constructors. They are now in a proper duel with Mercedes, and that is something to give them a little bit more excitement, because I thought initially they were going to be in the middle of no man's land, not really racing anybody, and that will give them something to chase, and that's good for us too. Then, of course, Yuki Tsunoda. Now this was much better. Now, remember what I've been telling you for many videos at this point, that the bottom 5 teams will do anything to score points. So now look what Yuki goes and does. He scores 6 of them. 6! Yes, he did get some extra points because of Alonso's penalty, but you gotta be in it to win it, and Yuki was very much in it, and he looked very convincing whilst doing so. And it kind of makes you think about what would have happened in Jeddah had he been able to get away from Magnussen sooner, and maybe have gone on the hunt for Hülkenberg, and maybe scored a cheeky point in Jeddah. 6 points right now at the beginning of the season, before convergence really becomes a thing, is a huge deal, and really sets them apart from the other 3 teams who have yet to score. Haas are slightly on their tail, but I'll get to them in a second. Yuki Tsunoda looked far more composed, he got it into Q3 again, and stayed within the relative top 10 for the longest time. And he didn't put a foot wrong, he was very quiet, very unassuming, and for Yuki Tsunoda to be very quiet and unassuming, that's a huge win. He managed to take all of the theatrics he had in Bahrain and tone it down considerably. I think he can sense that he has the initial upper hand in the battle as to who is going to get the second Red Bull seat, especially since Checo had a compromised weekend with the floor damage, and therefore on the road he gets the result, it's 5th place. Yuki, he gets 7th place in the 6th fastest car. That is a major boost, especially since your teammate, who is lauded to be better than you, doesn't get another result. It wasn't quite as dire as it was in Jeddah, but not much better, but again, we'll get to him later. But Yuki right now should be really pleased with this result, and I think that RB, or Racing Bulls, or VCarb, they'll be very pleased with this result. 6 points in one go in 2024, that's huge. Now we can get on to Haas, and once again, Haas has proved the doubters wrong. More points, and this time, double points, 9th and 10th. Yes, okay, it doesn't sound that amazing, but for Haas, this is huge. In one race, they have scored a quarter of the amount of points that they scored throughout the entirety of 2023. No red flags, no chaos. This was done on the road, and Hülkenberg throughout the entire race looked convincing, and you were thinking, yeah, he's going to score points. Kevin the Tank Engine was able to score points after all. And yes, Kevin did play the team game in swapping positions, but at the end of the day, Haas are doing what they need to do to try and score as many points as possible. No one really thought that they would get anything at this point. Many thought that Haas would end up with a duck at the end of the year, or barely scoring anything. The race pace throughout the entire Grand Prix looked solid. There were no points where you saw Haas completely fall down the order. They were hanging in there, and I can't wait to see what Haas can do now with maybe a more traditional upgrade path, and now they are scoring points. And yes, Haas aren't grabbing headlines in the traditional sense like they used to do, and Gunther Steiner's no longer there anymore, but I'm glad that he's fallen on his feet, because I did not expect him to be doing the post-race interviews, and that was really nice to see. He has a future in punditry, and good on him. But I'm really sad that he didn't take the opportunity to call Carlos a bit of a rock star. You know, say DTS. Now we get on to the meh category, and Fernando Alonso is very much a major resident here because that 20-second penalty really brought him down to this category because, for the most part, before then, he looked really solid. He was able to capitalize on the virtual safety car, the only driver to do so, and was able to bring that car up to what looked like possibly, at one point, 5th place. Again, very good result, similar to what he got previously in the season. But then it all started to come apart when we got to that last lap with George Russell. Now, this is where it gets a little bit hairy. Alonso put out a statement saying he had no intention for George to end up the way he did, and that had gravel not been present and it had been AstroTurf or just more tarmac, but the stewards deemed him guilty of destabilising Russell, having braked into the corner 100 metres earlier than previous, the jury considering his driving as erratic and unusual, which meant that he would have had apparently a calculated error to his decision. It might have been the case because Aston Martin chose not to appeal the decision, and thusly they are going into this with 3 penalty points on his licence. Now, I'm not saying that Alonso deliberately brake-checked George Russell, nor do I think he intended George to crash out. It just so happened that the dirty air meant that George's car was destabilised, he went off, and then the rest, well, you saw. It was unfortunate for all concerned, and otherwise it would have been a really good performance, and it now meant that this race, ultimately, on the result table, Lance Stroll did better. Yeah, Lance did better. Now, Checo, I'm going to get this out of the way. No, Checo did not suck today because his car was damaged. His floor was compromised when he was overtaking Alonso, which would explain why, after he overtook the Aston Martin, he really couldn't make any inroads on Piastri, and thusly he was compromised to being in 5th place. But he did end up 1 place higher than he had been. But it does make you wonder though, had he not impeded Hülkenberg and he kept his 3rd position on the track, then we might have seen him in contention for staying in 3rd, or maybe going into a little bit of an argy-bargy match with the likes of Charles Leclerc, and then maybe have gotten that 2nd place after all, and done a little bit of damage limitation for the likes of Red Bull. I don't think he would have been in contention for the win because Carlos was just that good, but he would have been on the podium, maybe even 2nd, breaking apart the Ferraris. So I would say that Checo did okay, given that he had a car that was damaged for nearly the last third. But what this shows you all is that the RB20 is not perfect at every single track. Throughout the entire weekend, that car did not look entirely convincing. It didn't look amazing. And it just proves once again that Max Verstappen, the Max Factor, is the big differentiator for making the RB20 better than everything else. Take away Max Verstappen, and you got a Red Bull team which is sort of, yes, the quickest car, but not by much. Which will mean that, of course, they are still odds-on favourite to win most races or be in contention for the win, but it now means that Ferrari are in the game. And if McLaren catch up, they'll be in the game too. And then who knows what will happen with Mercedes and Aston Martin, but we could have at least 3 teams looking possibly likely to win a race or get big podium positions. That is great. But as for Checo right now, he shouldn't be disappointed. Yes, it was sloppy with the likes of the impeding with Hülkenberg, but people can get impeded, they don't intend to, it's just bad timing. But yeah, I would say Perez was decent. I wouldn't call him a loser, because it was just bad luck when it came to that floor damage. I put Gasly here, and you might be thinking, really? An Alpine not losing? Well, it's small potatoes, honestly, because the reason why I put him in here instead of being in the losers section with Alpine is because for a brief second, that car had promise and it was competitive with another car in the points chasing it. Before, obviously, he had to come into the pit stops and then he was right back down the order again. But he still finished ahead of Ocon, and he still looked like he was able to get more out of the car than Ocon did. And I know that Ocon had some issues, but Gasly just looked like the better of the two on the day. And again, it's not much, but it's something. It's some little promise, a glimmer of hope that maybe there is some performance in that car. So I would describe this as a teeny tiny little win. It's something. Now, Williams. The big question is this. Was the decision that they made regarding Sargeant's car worth it? Well, it's either one of two things. It's a very small yes or a solid maybe. Yes, the Williams car was competitive enough to go for a point with Alex just behind Magnussen at the end of the day. It's not like he was 15th solidly, he had no chance of a point or binned it like he might have done in turn 6 again. Oh, we would have heard it non-stop. It would have just been absolutely carnage for Williams. They would have been sent to the dark bit. But at the end of the day, Alex wasn't able to fulfill the promise that he gave Logan as payback by giving him points, or at least the team some points. But his very small crumb of comfort here is that Williams can be considered for points at pretty much every race now. We have seen at all 3 races that they nearly score points. They are very much in the bottom 5, but they are near the top of the bottom 5. And that is something to take comfort in, that as they extract more performance from this car, and maybe if they can get Sargeant in for a full race weekend and build a proper chassis or at least fix the current one, we might see Williams come alive and maybe be in the hunt for 6th place or at least try and get 7th again. But it's early days for Williams, and I still think that maybe it was worth it with Alex, but it still wasn't a complete comeback story or one with a happy ending. I would say it's a very so-so ending. Now, okay, the losers, and we definitely have to start with Mercedes. We all thought that Brazil last year was their lowest ebb. I think this weekend was even lower than that. You got a car that had a mechanical failure and DNF'd, and then you had the other car DNF on the last lap in a very horrific looking crash. And a car proving to be very inconsistent. The team wasting a lot of time in practice trying to experiment frantically just goes to show that the cost cap and the lack of testing is really compromising Mercedes right now because they can't just pay their way out of a problem. And also, it just feels like the team is really in a little bit of disarray, with Lewis Hamilton being more despondent than ever, seemingly having checked out and just thinking, oh, well, there's no hope for me now, or I'm just used to being in Q2. It just shows that Lewis in a funk right now. It's sad, and I really don't want to see him in this situation. George is trying to rally the troops, and he is trying to just ring that car, just drive out of its skin, trying to score something. And at one point, he was in the top 5. He looked really good for some solid points, but it did fall away from him, and he wasn't really lighting the timesheets up all that much. And then, of course, we got that situation with Fernando Alonso. He then goes off, he bins the car, and once again on the last lap, he has an incident. But I really wouldn't call this a George Russell incident fully. I still feel like Alonso was to blame somewhat, but he had no intention for George to end up the way he did. Lewis Hamilton's engine going bang, ugh, that's a bad look for a Mercedes. They usually have bulletproof reliability, so you feel like they couldn't even rely on just bringing it home. No, couldn't even do that. George, yikes. That looked scary. Now, I know that many of you will be calling him a crybaby, a whinger, because you hear him on videos that have been shared. I shared it on my Twitter too, about him going like, red flag, red flag, red flag. And you think, oh, come on, George, stop doing that. I can understand why. The result would have been going back 1 lap where he would have been still ahead of Fernando and he would have kept 6th place on the road. Yeah, okay, you'd be thinking that, oh, he's just doing that strategically. But no, put yourself in his shoes or his car. If you were in that situation, that you'd gone off the track, that the wheel went underneath you, tipped you over, meaning that you're at 45 degrees, you can't see what is going on, you can't see any cars behind you, you don't know how far they are behind you, you try and get out, but again, you're at an angle, so you might fall out of the car, underneath the car, and then you might get T-boned. That is scary. It's a miracle that the marshals were able to quickly get the VSC on, the double yellows, meaning that George was in no trouble. George Russell in that moment was scared. I don't think he was thinking strategically and going, oh, right, chaps, I'll call a red flag. Yeah, well, pip, pip, what ho. No. He's just thinking, I don't want to die. Come on. It's not a slow corner. Then if it had gone straight into that car, George probably would have been killed, or at worst, severely injured, because he would have had no time to get out of the car. He couldn't get out of the car properly. He was scared, terrified. I'd be scared if I were in that situation. It does lead to a very bad weekend for Mercedes, and I feel bad for George too. But I don't feel that Alonso was intending for him to crash like that. It's just an unfortunate event, but yeah, okay, I've had enough saying that. Then we've got Sauber. My God, pit stops. Oh, this was so bad, especially since Bottas was in contention for 10th place. Sure, he might not have ended up with a point, but he was at least in with a chance. But now we've got this situation where their pit stop guns are leading to them cross-threading the wheel nuts. By the way, cross-threading means that they put it in, they go, and it completely messes it up so it's no use to anybody. And you know you've got a problem when the commentators are saying that a slow stop for you is actually a really good one. Ugh. And yes, Joe had a problem too, as well as a faulty gearbox, but this is a really bad situation. It's a fundamental issue that this brand new pit equipment is just not working. It just goes to show that even if the car has a good day and has a chance for maybe a point or be in contention for one, that it doesn't matter. They may as well not turn up because they go in the pits and then the pit stop completely screws it all up. They end up at the back. What's the point? Now we got Verstappen. Now, I told you, I predicted that Verstappen would have at least one DNF this season through a mechanical issue, and that turned out to be correct. The RB20 proving a little bit more fragile than the RB19 was, which was absolutely rock solid. It did not put a foot wrong, but this one did. And in this case, it was the brakes that failed. Many people were thinking it was a power unit issue, but no. It was the rear right brake catching fire and then exploding in the pits. It's a good thing there was nobody around because there was a lot of shrapnel there, a lot of carbon dust. That could have been nasty. And whew, just Max having that problem, and then it meant that that was the end of his race. And the last time he had a DNF was back in Australia 2 years ago. He now missed out on the chance of having 10 wins in a row once again, which had been interrupted by, wouldn't you know it, Carlos Sainz. But, of course, Max is not worried right now. He's just taking on the chin. He'll think, oh, okay, it happens. It was bound to happen, because to be fair, it was bound to happen, because over 40 Grand Prix and no DNFs through mechanical issues, that's not bad at all. So he knew that his luck was about to run out. He's still ahead of Leclerc in the title race, and there's 21 races to go. Wow, we're not even down to less than 20 to go. That's quite a statistic. Then I've got to talk about Daniel Ricciardo. I know, I keep going on about it. I'm not having a dig at him, but you just got to look at the facts. In Q1, he goes out. He did have a major track limits breach, and then you get the rhetoric saying that he was completely lost. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't extract any more. And this just sounded more and more like the McLaren season he had in 2022. Not like, oh, I think he's washed, but it's like, there is something not right with that car, and Daniel cannot extract the full potential of it. Okay, he was able to get it back up to 12th place in the race. Not too bad. And therefore he was able to try and get something out of the weekend. But at the end of the day, the commentators were just not aware of his presence. He had a Bottas day. No one was really paying attention to him. On top of that, you've got Yuki in Q3 again, and scoring points, major points too for a bottom 5 team. That is huge and a very major blow for Daniel trying to get a place at the Red Bull top table. It's just not looking good at the beginning. Yes, I know it's early days and things could change. The car could come back to him. He might find his mojo again. But right now, at the beginning, the opening statements, they are very much in Yuki's favour. Yes, Tsunoda had a very major wobble at the beginning, being very aggressive and potentially dangerous, but he's calmed down and he scored points. And I'm pretty sure in Jeddah, had he not been stuck behind Kevin the Tank Engine, he would have scored another point, maybe even 2. But right now, Racing Bulls are trying to convince people that they are the 6th fastest team. And now, thanks to Tsunoda and not Ricciardo, they have now proven that point. And I'm sure that if this keeps up in Suzuka, and Tsunoda gets more points and Daniel doesn't, and he crashes out in either Q2 or Q1, we are now going to enter the second phase of helmet marker bashing. I'm not bagging on Daniel for the sake of it. It's just, if he wants to be in the second Red Bull seat, this is a very, very questionable strategy. I'm just saying that. But you got to admit, Haas getting a double points finish when just a couple of months ago they were promising nothing is a very major win for them. And I think there's some major hope for them going forward with Komatsu in charge. To find out why exactly, you can go and watch this video next about why I'm now starting to like what I'm hearing from the American yet not American team.